Hi, I'm with Epic Pivot. I'm Tabitha Scott, and today we are talking with Theresa Agresta, and she is co-founder of CultureTalk. We are really excited to have her here to talk about some things that you've heard us talk about: cognitive diversity, you've heard us talk about innovation and brand and culture. And so we wanted her to be able to talk with you a bit about what CultureTalk does and how they are shaking up companies and doing really cool things. So with that, Theresa, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself and, what is CultureTalk?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much, Tabitha, for giving me a chance to connect with you here. And I love how you described that. We're shaking things up. So great to have that reputation. I am Theresa Agresta, as you mentioned, and at CultureTalk, we are giving organizations an opportunity to turn culture into a tangible business asset. And there are many components to that, but at the end of the day, we're working to take culture from what feels like a nebulous concept and turn it into a tool through the delivery of some assessment tools, facilitation materials, and a trained network of providers like Tabitha who bring the work to organizations.
So what typically, whenever you do these engagements, how do you keep it from being different than like sitting in a classroom and just having things thrown at you? How do you engage or make this different for businesses?
Yeah. So I think that the key, we often talk about that as sort of like the so what, now what. There are lots of tools out there, right? Sometimes companies feel like they're inundated with tools, and the difference and the way we approach things is all about the activation of the material.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to get your results and then validate what's true for you, layer your own story. So whether it's the story of the individuals or the story of the organization, it's getting personal.
Yeah.
By the time you add those stories on, and then to actively engage in, so what, now what? Like, what are we going to do with the outcomes of this? How can we apply it to our business goals? And, make sure that the results from an assessment don't become something that just throws dust on the shelf.
Yeah. So this is an assessment, and it shows people their primary and their dominant archetypes and their latent archetypes. Could you explain for our listeners a bit more about what an archetype is and where that came from?
Yeah, sure. So archetypes came from the work of Carl Jung, and basically they're stories. They're patterns that repeat themselves, and we find them in human beings, in individuals, and we also find those same patterns in groups. And so by measuring these patterns, recurring stories that show up, and we can identify and point to these same archetypal stories in ancient texts, in scriptures, in religions, and, all of our written artistic materials, our advertising, and we can also measure them in each human being and really create some clarity around the things we have in common. Like, so this is like it brings us all into the same page. It gives us a common language to talk about topics that are a little intangible or, feel hard to address. And culture definitely falls into that camp. It can be challenging to talk about culture. This gives us that language.
Yeah, and so it's individuals, but it's also company cultures. So say more about that, because I know you were a PR expert, a brand expert before you co-founded this organization. And so how does this tool work, not just for individuals, but understanding about yourself, but how can it change cultures and the brand, of an organization?
Yeah. Great. So the knowing archetype can help an organization understand what are the unwritten rules of engagement here. Mm-hmm. We talk about culture as being the way we do things, mm-hmm. related to the behaviors we tolerate and those that we don't tolerate. And, there's a lot of times where an organization feels like they've done the active work to identify those things.
Yeah.
They might create a set of, values, even, mission statements, vision statements. They might identify elements of the culture that they think are important and communicate those and put them different places visibly on the website and in visible places in an organization. But ultimately, they haven't really necessarily gotten underneath the surface of that to understand the drivers and the motivators that will continue to be active and cause the decisions on repeat that we
Yeah.
make. And
Yeah.
those invisible things that impact relationships, those what we call our gut decisions, and the things that just seem to be operating almost again under the surface. Some recent one of our partners described it as the undercurrent. What's
Yeah.
the undercurrent of the organization? And so when we measure the undercurrent, we bring to the surface those challenging conversations that are oftentimes hard to identify. And archetype is a great tool to allow us to see those things, to name them, and to talk about them. And they have strengths and they have shadows. So we have, really positive things associated with each of the patterns. We have triggers and things that show up more on our, list of weaknesses or challenges that might be present in a group.
Yeah, it was interesting. Our managing partner and founder, Michael Graber, also comes from a PR advertising background. So he is a brilliant storyteller. And we were looking at this tool originally for our leadership team. How is our leadership team going to gel when we did a merger with another consulting company? And so it was really helpful from that perspective, but I didn't think about the brand overall of Epic Pivot until we went through the brand exercise when you and I were going through the certification process together when I was learning. And it was really interesting because our mission being about real purposeful transformation, how was that going to translate into the interviews and the culture and the process that we went through for that? And it was interesting to do a gap analysis of what we ended up being and who we want to be. In our case, we had, we were very high on creative and the hero archetype, as well as explorers. And then, we had latent ones like ruler. And the ruler one is more like, we know everything, there's going to be a great process in place. So, working more on the innovation and culture side with companies, it was interesting to see our strengths and then our latencies. So any thoughts or comments about, that combination or how other companies might use their combinations of kind of dominant, culture types versus their latent archetypes?
Yeah, so you brought up a couple of really interesting things there, and that speaks back to what we were saying a moment ago about how are you going to use the outcomes? And there are several ways, right? So one is brand. We can look at, what are the patterns that we're finding in the organization and how do we message that in a unique way to speak to the audiences we're trying to attract to our business. And so the brand component of it helps us to say, this is the unique organization and those combination of patterns that make us us.
Yeah.
And that's the door that you mentioned, prior to this company, I was a co-founder at a brand development company, and that's how we found this work in the first place. It was super powerful to be able to measure those storylines and deliver them through the lens of brand. But then what we really understood was there were so many additional activation points that would add value. And so when we think about your transformation work at Epic Pivot, being able to identify that gap, this is who we are today, our point A, this is how we're showing up in all of our glory, and these are the elements of that profile, that culture profile that are kind of hanging us up. What do we want to change? Where do we
Yeah.
want to go? What do we need to shift? What might we need to lose? What do we want to enhance? And so being able to have that framework of the patterns allows an organization to then make some clear, strategic, business-driven decisions. So this is not just a feel-good conversation,
Yeah.
although it is an awful lot of fun.
Yeah. And, I'm glad you brought that up, because when people think about assessments, straight away, they think of organizational development usually, or getting the right butts in the right seats, or
Yeah.
team building and all of the obvious things. But one of the things that I think is cool about Culture Talk is how it can actually increase productivity, because in the last couple of years, and especially after COVID, we've seen a shift of companies doing less with things like innovation or peripheral programs, and doing more with how can we get leaner, more efficient, more productive. So can you say more about that specifically? Like what are the sticky teeth that make this tangible for companies that really need to do more with less?
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple great things about that just a moment ago, and it's really about enhancing what we have long called, and people pushing back on this, like the soft skills, right?
Mhm.
If we look now at the changes in workplace demands, or needs since the pandemic, the need for collaboration has just astronomically risen. And how do we create better collaboration? Well, we know the people we're trying to collaborate with better. We get to know them as human beings. We shortcut to effectiveness and shave off all kinds of time that might otherwise be distractions to our time and our energy, by understanding better who are these human beings, so that we can collaborate better, so that we can get the right people in the right positions more quickly, so we can shortchange those inevitable speed, road bumps that we face when we're pulling together teams, and forming them and trying to get them to understand how to be effective together. So the ability to shave time off in all of those ways really leads to more productivity, as well as a lot of tools and materials that help to address conflict if it does arise.
Yeah.
So many ways to keep the conflict and the drama from coming up to begin with.
Mhm.
And then when it does, tools and materials to help people address it and move past it.
I love moving past the drama.
Yeah.
Nobody has time for it.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, is there anything else that you think listeners would want to know about Culture Talk? I really just wanted to bring you on board today, talk a little bit about some aspects that aren't obvious when you're talking about assessments, some of the different things, and then let our listeners know how they can engage.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think one of the important things I love to share about Culture Talk is the fabulous network. And, Tabitha being a prime example of people who have been trained to bring this work out to organizations and really tap into their own expertise and the systems they bring, and bring Culture Talk and the program is in as a foundational element to catapult their results. And those are the, growing base of use cases that help organizations to achieve those kinds of business results, because there is a clear road to drive down. And I think that that clarity that the tool provides enhances the outcomes of the work that you're doing.
Nice. Much appreciated. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We love hearing about Culture Talk, and we love working with you all, and look forward to doing some more exciting work with companies out there. So until next time, this is Tabitha and Theresa, and enjoy your epic pivots.
Thanks, Tabitha. Bye-bye.